I really think that we've just been able to encapsulate the amount of difference in not only in my voice but in the kind of person I've become over these past 2.5 years.
He was told he'd never make it past the first round. Nobody in that audition room believed a nervous, overweight teenager in an ill-fitting suit could do anything more than embarrass himself on national television. And then he opened his mouth, and the entire room went silent. This is the story of Jonathan Antoine, a boy who was bullied from the age of 4, who found an unlikely stage partner in a girl from his school choir, who became an international sensation almost overnight, and who then spent the next decade fighting battles that had nothing to do with singing at all. Jonathan was born in January 1995 in Harold Hill, Essex, the son of a police officer and a homemaker. From his earliest years in school, he was a target. He was mocked for his size, isolated by classmates, and by his own later admission, he turned to food and to music as the only things that offered him comfort. It's a pattern that mental health researchers have written about for years. The children who face chronic social rejection often retreat into whatever gives them a sense of control, and for Jonathan, that retreat happened to intersect with an extraordinary natural instrument. He has described those early years as one spent feeling permanently on the outside, watching other children socialize with an ease he simply didn't have, and finding refuge instead in melody, in the structure and discipline that music offered when almost nothing else in his world felt stable. At West Hatch High School in Chigwell, a singing teacher named Jenny Ewington recognized something in him that his tormentors never could. Under her guidance, he began training seriously, tackling repertoire far beyond what most teenagers would attempt, working through pieces like Where Is Love from the musical Oliver, and the Latin hymn Panis Angelicus. His voice became something of a quiet legend among classmates, some of whom began referring to him simply as the boy with the incredible voice, even as the bullying outside the music room continued largely unchanged. By his early teens, he was auditioning for all 4 of London's major music conservatoires and was accepted into every single one, eventually choosing the junior program at the Royal Academy of Music. At a regional music festival in 2010, he delivered a performance of Bring Him Home from Les Miserables that reportedly earned the highest score in the event's history, a small but telling sign that his talent was beginning to outpace the environment that had spent years trying to diminish him. It was at school that he met Charlotte Giaconelli, a classmate with her own strong voice and stage presence. The two began singing together, and by 2012 they had decided to audition for Britain's Got Talent as a classical crossover duo. When they walked out in March of that year, the panel's skepticism was obvious. Simon Cowell later admitted, in interviews given after the audition aired, that his first impression of Jonathan was shaped entirely by his appearance and his visible nerves. Then the pair began to sing, and within moments the mood in the room shifted completely. Cowell would go on to compare Jonathan's voice to Luciano Pavarotti, one of the most celebrated tenors of the 20th century, and the clip of that audition spread across the world within days, drawing millions of views and turning 2 unknown teenagers into overnight celebrities. What followed was a run through the competition that captured the public's imagination. Jonathan and Charlotte advanced through the semi-finals performing Caruso, and then reached the final in May 2012, where they returned to the piece that had made them famous and once again received a standing ovation. By that point, much of the country assumed the trophy was already theirs. But when the votes were counted, they didn't win. That distinction went to Ashley and Pudsey, a dance act built around a train dog, a result that still gets discussed in retrospectives about the show more than a decade later, often cited as one of British television's most talked about upsets. Jonathan has spoken since about how deflating that loss felt in the moment, describing a sinking feeling in his stomach even as he fought to keep his composure in front of a live audience and millions of viewers at home. Yet in a strange twist that the entertainment industry is well acquainted with, finishing second turned out to be the beginning of something far bigger than a talent show trophy. Within a day of the final, Cowell's label, Psycho, had moved to sign the duo to a recording contract reportedly worth £1 million, an outcome that quietly proved a runner-up finish could sometimes be worth more than a win. By the autumn, their debut album together had climbed into the UK top 5, eventually selling more than 250,000 copies, an achievement that far exceeded what many expected from 2 teenagers who had lost on national television only months earlier. For a while, it looked like a genuine fairy tale. Documentary crews followed the pair on tour through Europe. They performed for global audiences, and Cowell reportedly apologized on camera for having floated, during the audition process, the idea that Jonathan might be better off going solo. But the comment turned out to be more prophetic than anyone wanted to admit. As the 2 teenagers grew older and their musical tastes diverged, Jonathan drawn deeper into classical opera, Charlotte increasingly interested in musical theater, the partnership began to strain. Their second album still charted well, but it also included, for the first time, solo tracks from each of them, a quiet signal of what was coming. In February 2014, the duo announced they were parting ways. Both had been offered individual contracts with Sony Classical, and in their joint statement they tried to frame the split as a natural evolution rather than a falling out. The press was less generous, with some outlets speculating that the relationship had ended on frostier terms than either side admitted publicly. Years later, Jonathan reflected candidly that Charlotte had been the one who gave him the confidence to walk onto that stage in the first place, and that their partnership had simply run its natural course as two young solo-minded singers found it harder to keep compromising on a shared sound. He also acknowledged, with some understatement, that Cowell's early suggestion had essentially been proven right. What's less often discussed is how completely the two lost touch afterward. Despite having been friends since childhood, Jonathan admitted in a 2017 television interview that they barely spoke anymore, attributing it to the demands of the industry rather than any lingering resentment. Rumors that the pair had secretly been a couple circulated for years, fueled by their obvious on-stage chemistry, but both have consistently maintained they were only ever singing partners and close friends, with Charlotte once describing Jonathan as being like a brother to her. Jonathan's solo career, once it began, proved that the talent audiences had responded to in 2012 was no fluke. His debut solo album Tenore, released in October 2014, reached number 1 on the UK Classical Album Chart, making him the youngest tenor ever to achieve that ranking. That same year, the legendary tenor Placido Domingo personally invited him to perform at the iTunes Festival, an endorsement from one of opera's most respected living figures. He toured extensively across the United States and Europe, released a follow-up album called Believe in 2016, and in 2020 recorded a concert film with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra that aired on American public television, featuring his first recorded performance of Puccini's famously demanding aria Nessun Dorma. But behind the growing discography and the sold-out venues, Jonathan was carrying weight that had nothing to do with the scale. In multiple interviews over the years, he has spoken openly about being diagnosed with depression around the time of his Britain's Got Talent debut, a condition serious enough that it once forced him to cancel a scheduled performance at the Royal Albert Hall. He has also discussed a difficult relationship in his late teens with a partner who was openly struggling with her own severe mental health issues, an experience he has described as emotionally devastating for someone who was already fighting his own battles. Throughout it, he leaned heavily on his family, his father John, his mother Tracy, and his older sister, also confusingly named Charlotte, who remained a steady presence at his shows. Rather than staying silent about any of it, Jonathan became an outspoken mental health advocate, and later co-authored children's books focused on anti-bullying themes, using his own childhood experience to try to help other kids recognize they weren't alone. Then, in April 2022, shortly after his 27th birthday, Jonathan received a diagnosis that reframed how he understood his entire life: autism spectrum disorder. He didn't share the news publicly until Autism Awareness Day in 2024, writing on social media that reassessing a life already lived was, in his words, a frightening thing to sit with. For Jonathan, the diagnosis offered an explanation for things he'd struggled to understand about himself for years: his intense focus on music, his difficulties navigating social situations, and the sense he'd carried since childhood of being slightly out of step with everyone around him. Suddenly, the years of feeling like an outsider, even among people who cared about him, started to make a different kind of sense. It wasn't that something had been wrong with him all along, it was that his brain had simply always processed the world differently, and no one around him, including Jonathan himself, had the language to recognize it at the time. Rather than treating the diagnosis as something negative, he described it as clarifying, even liberating, while also acknowledging how unsettling it was to look back at decades of his life through an entirely new lens. He has spoken about how the diagnosis helped him make sense of why the bullying cut as deep as it did, why forming close relationships had often felt harder for him than it seemed to for others, and why the discipline and intensity he brought to his vocal training may have been connected to the same wiring that made social situations so much more difficult to read. Since going public, he has used his platform to speak about neurodiversity acceptance alongside his existing advocacy for mental health and anti-bullying causes, framing all three as different facets of the same message: that being different is not the same as being broken. Around the same period, Jonathan also underwent a significant physical transformation, losing a substantial amount of weight through consistent daily walking, careful management of a thyroid condition, and a deliberate shift in his relationship with food, a habit he'd leaned on as emotional comfort since childhood. By 2024, Photographs showed a visibly slimmer, healthier version of the young man who'd first stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, and he has spoken about feeling stronger than he had in a decade. He's been careful to frame the change as being about his health and his own comfort in his body, not about conforming to anyone else's expectations. Today, Jonathan continues to record and tour, releasing new music that blends his classical training with more contemporary material, and continues to speak publicly about mental health, neurodiversity, and bullying prevention. Charlotte Giaconelli, meanwhile, moved into musical theater, appearing in West End productions, and the two rarely, if ever, speak these days. What makes Jonathan's story resonate isn't the million-pound record deal or the viral audition clip, as remarkable as those moments were. It's everything that happened after the cameras stopped rolling, the quiet, unglamorous work of surviving depression, understanding a late-in-life diagnosis, rebuilding a relationship with his own body, and choosing again and again to speak honestly about all of it rather than hide behind the polish of celebrity. The boy who was bullied for being different spent years learning that the very things that once made him a target were the same things that made his voice, and his story, impossible to ignore.